All right, welcome everybody. I'm Yuval Levin. I'm Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and have had the good fortune to be a faculty member with the Hertog Foundation this summer and many past summers. And I'm very pleased to be here tonight to moderate a conversation with Robert Doar, the president of the American Enterprise Institute. And so among other things, my boss. I'll be nice as a result. It's really a conversation about the nature of think tanks, the future of the think tank, and Robert's own view of his role in running an institution of public policy research. Robert joined AEI in 2014 to create a new program on poverty studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He became the Institute's president in 2019, last year. Prior to joining AEI, he had served for more than 2 decades in various leadership roles in social service programs in New York City and New York State, and otherwise in the fight against poverty. In the first half of the conversation, I'm going to pose some questions to him, and we'll talk a little bit about his career and about think tank work. And then we'll hear from a few political studies fellows who've submitted advanced questions. And after that, we'll take questions from all of you, from the wider audience, which you can submit via Zoom's Q&A function. If your question is selected, then you'll be recognized to ask it, and you don't need to wait. You can put your questions in along the way as our conversation proceeds. Robert, thank you very much for being here and doing this. To begin with, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your career. You've got a pretty exceptional story for a DC policy person. You haven't followed the usual path, and I think everyone might be interested in hearing a bit about how you have ended up doing what you're doing.
Well, thanks, Yuval, and I greatly appreciate being able to participate in this discussion, and I'm a great admirer of this program. So I feel honored to be welcomed into a very august body, and I'm not so worried about you, but I'm certainly worried about the students and their give and take, but I think that'll be fun. That's what this is all about. Yeah, AEI has a history of having really strong academics and great thinkers about the issues and challenges we face in America. And it also has some journalists and some writers, but then there's a little group of us that are former practitioners and people who've actually worked in government on difficult issues. And that's the path that I took. A long time ago, I was a journalist. I loved being a writer and editor of a local newspaper. And I worked for a little bit at the Washington Monthly when I was very young. So I had interest and sense of public policy discussion and thinking and writing. But then when I got my chance, I went to work for Governor Pataki at the very beginning of his administration in 1994. New York had been run by Mario Cuomo for 3 terms, and I was sort of part of the group that wanted to turn that around and change that and bring a new thinking to Albany. And that was just a tremendous amount of fun. The late 90s saw some reform in the world that I worked in, welfare policy. President Clinton signed welfare reform in 1996. Governor Thompson, Governor Engler in Michigan had begun doing some important things to change that world. A lot of that had been inspired by the work of think tank people, Charles Murray and others, Larry Mead, who had written about how our social services programs and what had come down from Washington in the Great Society had failed. And so I was part of an effort to try to take the ideas that had been developed in think tanks around the country and bring them to application in a difficult area of public policy. Did that for 20 years. I liked it. I learned a lot about working in the executive branch of a state government, and then I learned even more working for Mayor Bloomberg for 7 years as the head of a very large social service agency there. Besides police and education, I ran the 3rd largest agency, so I was a manager. But after a while of doing that, Yuval, you get worn down and you want to stop and think for a while and write and reflect a little bit. And that is a part of the public dialogue. And Arthur Brooks offered me an opportunity to come to AEI and to do just that. And so I went from managing 14,000 people to managing myself and the research assistant. And it was good for me. It was good for me to do a little reflecting, do a little writing, do a little reading, and contribute to the public debate in that way, in the public discussion. And I came to really love this environment and this world and like AEI, and thought AEI could be even better than it was. And so when Arthur decided to leave after 10 years, and I kind of missed managing, I raised my hand and said I'd be interested in helping to lead the institution. And I've been here a year, and it's been a lot of fun. And it is more of a management task. I'm not writing as much as I was in the past, and I miss that a little bit. But I also love being able to recruit people like you and bring you to AI and others to do the work that is really outstanding. So that's my background. Maybe that's longer than you wanted to hear, but I come from the world of practitioners, but a lot of people that work only as practitioners or leaders in public agencies, they forget how to write and think and reflect. Mm-hmm. I am lucky that I didn't forget all those skills completely, and I had a background in journalism prior to going into government service that was at least a little bit helpful in getting me back into the task of communicating through writing.
So let's think together a little about those two arenas. You mentioned welfare reform and Charles Murray's work. That highlights the difference that you sometimes find in speed and pace between what happens in the think tank world and what happens in the policy world. Charles Murray wrote about welfare reform beginning in the mid-1980s. His work didn't really come to fruition for more than a decade. And in some ways, that's fast. What you see with ideas that move in welfare and education, healthcare, is that they take many, many years to be nurtured and developed in the think tank world and the public policy arena, sometimes in the academy. And then a moment comes and the policy world is ready for them. And hopefully they'll be ready to be of service. How do you now, in running a think tank, think about the way that these two worlds can interface with each other? Those two very different sets of pressures, the one to build the idea and let it grow, and the other to be ready to answer the public policy world as things change, as politics makes demands on policy institutions. How do you deal with the tension between the very different ways of thinking in these two arenas?
Well, it's a challenge. You're absolutely right about welfare reform. There were thousands of sort of authors of that. Mickey Kaus wrote about it, Larry Mead wrote about it, Charles Murray wrote about it, Ron Haskins worked on it in the House, and it all bubbled up until there was this great political frustration where the country finally turned to a new idea, and in a bipartisan way, and that is often the way things work. As I look at the situation that we face today, we are working for the long term. We're thinking about ideas 10 years away, 20 years away. We're thinking about America how it's going to unfold in the next generation, and I want our scholars doing that. But I also want a part of AI and some people doing both, looking at the current and immediate demands of the policymakers, mostly in Washington, but not only in Washington. And so we try to do a little bit of both. We are embarked on a strategic plan exercise now, and we've sort of arrived at that we need a combination of big thinkers, really outstanding public intellectuals. I happen to think you're one of them. Who we can bring and to do that long-term work and that deeper thinking. But we also need technical experts that can be there when Congress decides to do something like tinker with unemployment insurance in the middle of a pandemic in a way that might disincentivize people to work, when we really know that they're stronger economically, they're healthier, they're more stronger parents when they're in employment, and keeping them out of employment for a prolonged period of time can be a big mistake. And I want our scholars over in the halls of Congress helping on that as well at the same time. So my view is that AI has to do a little bit of both, and we want to be good at both. And then I also want to measure us and evaluate us on how well we both develop really good long-term ideas and thinking, and also how we're affecting the public policy as it unveils on a day-to-day basis. So it's a challenge to do both, but I think AI has the resources and ability to do it. But we just have to keep at it and not settle on our past achievements, and know that these challenges are really serious, and we aren't as good as we think we are. We got to keep trying to get better.
Mm-hmm. In the realm where you spent the bulk of your time and where your expertise is rooted, the realm of welfare and social policy, economic mobility, Where do things stand now? Welfare reform is in the rearview mirror somewhat. We're in the midst of a pandemic that's also bringing about enormous economic challenges. Where were we on welfare before COVID-19, and where are we now, too?
Well, my view on this is a little bit different than the conventional liberal view or the conventional conservative view. My view in 2019 was that we had made great progress in combining an emphasis on employment with a variety of assistance programs that supplement wages by topping them up and making people have more income in their household through a combination of earnings plus benefits. And that had, properly measured and properly evaluated, as scholars at AI have done, really driven down the level of material hardship that had existed in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. And it made for a better situation. Not perfect, expensive, costly, to be sure, and filled with all kinds of, imperfections that frustrated us, but we had made progress. The two things that were happening, one thing was happening right then and is still happening now that is troubling the country and I'm worried about. And that is that while we had made progress for people at the very bottom, for a variety of factors, a certain group of people in the middle who had not really been associated with welfare programs, but had been working and sort of what you might call the white working class would be one way to characterize them, or the working class, they began to feel as if they were falling behind and not doing as well. They weren't getting retrained when their manufacturing jobs were lost. They weren't getting new opportunities when trade drove their businesses into the ground. In some cases it did, because foreign importers were providing products at a lower price. And they looked for an answer. And the funny thing is that ironically, people that were looking out for them turned to social policy and welfare policy. And I believe that there's been a little bit of interest in bringing back government transfer programs in a way to help this group that to some people is more politically attractive, but they still are suffering from the same things that people that were really struggling at the very bottom from, which is they're not working enough and they need to be into employment. And so I'm a little concerned. I may write a piece called The Welfarization of the Working Class. And I'm concerned about that also in the context of COVID, where big expansions of transfer programs are going on in an effort to sort of say, when any hardship happens, the federal government's going to rush in and shore up incomes all over the place. And I get the need for that, and I know why people want to do it, but I really worry about it becoming permanent and not a temporary adjustment in a matter of crisis. So the first question is, we were spending a lot of money that was shoring up wages, helping people with low wage jobs have a little bit more so they could be above the poverty line, and that was successful. We still had some problems in changing family formation. The extent to which children are born in single parent households is still a problem and a cause of levels of poverty that are too high. We need to make progress there. Now we have, and the last thing I'll just say is that the end of 2019 was a time when the combination of a vibrant or apparently vibrant economy producing jobs and opportunities, and wages were rising, and this sort of array of benefit programs that helped to shore up wages at the bottom was leading to historically low poverty levels, really remarkably low. And African-American child poverty was at an all-time low. So that was good. COVID has upset all of that. The pandemic and the closures and the shutdowns that have come with it have really upset that completely. And of course, to some, they will use this as an excuse to say, well, that never happened anyway. Just look at what's happening today. People are in desperate need, and we need to shore them up with government transfers. That's the only thing that really works. And that's what they're doing. And I'm worried about that. I'm worried about a return to a larger dependency and a larger belief that government should solve all problems, economic problems. It's a really real tragedy we're going through right now, and we have to not make mistakes that stick with us that we can't undo in the next 10 years. I'm not sure we're going to do that. But part of AI scholars' work is to try to warn the country about making choices now in the heat of an emergency that hurt us in the long term, and not just us, but hurt our country, hurt the very people we're most interested in helping, and that is people at the bottom. Mm-hmm. The key thing in fighting poverty is employment, above all else, helping people get into the world of work. That's the key. And the second key is family. And I will look forward to getting back to those essential ingredients and talking about those things when we get through the pandemic.
Some of that set of issues that you raise, especially about the working class and the question of the role of government, have been a source of great controversy within the right in the United States. AI is right of center, it's fair to say, and so is engaged in those debates and has some role to play in those debates. How do you think about that role? I should say maybe asking for a friend here or something, but how do you think about that role as a public policy institution in trying to guide the thinking of American conservatives toward an understanding of 21st century American political life that might have something to offer the larger society? What's the role of a think tank? What's the role of AI in this transformation that's happening?
Our role is maybe different than other roles. Other think tanks might take a different view of it. The view I view is that we're a research institution, to be sure. We want to do independent empirical research that's solid. We want to give our scholars academic freedom to do their best work without me or you telling them what to write or say. I like all that. But we also have a viewpoint, and we also have a perspective, and that view is focused on freedom and free markets and free people and limited government and a strong American role in the world and the dignity of the individual versus the collective. And I think our role, I don't know, some other think tank may have a different role, but our role is to bring the best, most independent, most credible research to the hard problems the country faces from the perspective of people who place a high premium on freedom and on the individual and on the dignity of the individual versus the collective. So I want our scholars to do great work, but I want them to fight socialism. I want them to do great work, but I want them to, not buy into identity politics. And I want them to do great work, but I want them to think and say that America plays an important role in promoting freedom and democracy around the world, and free markets and free trade. So that's the role I think we play. Now, the point you raised, which I've sort of skipped over because we don't like to admit it, but it's a dispute in our own house, is that the right of center world is a little upset about some of those very fundamental beliefs. And I think that I think that upset is not as dramatic as some people say. It's a difference in emphasis or shades a little bit. I don't want to say that, Josh Hawley or Marco Rubio should be excommunicated from the conservative world because they've shown an interest in national industrial policy. But I want AI to be a place through your leadership as much as anyone else, but others as well, where we bring people of different perspectives within that broad understanding to work these things out and to find what the sort of conservative movement should stand for together. So I do have we all want to be an intellectual hub and convening place for people who see things in a way that is consistent with our values. And our values are freedom, the Constitution of the United States, economic opportunity for all, and the individual over the collective. And so within that, I guess there's some plenty of room for little disagreements on the margins. Some of the disagreements I've seen have troubled me a little bit and seem a little bit too much. I don't really like the idea that the current president is viewed as the champion of the conservative movement. I'm from New York. You know, when I was, maybe I'm getting a little too far into this and going to make a mistake here, but I wrote an op-ed during the campaign reminding everybody that he really was a Rockefeller Republican. He is a spender. He's a believer in big government and big expenditures, and not as committed to free markets and free people as I think he should be. Well, we've seen that played out, and it's led to a lot of people, for lots of good reasons, to sort of try to ignore those differences within the conservative movement in an effort to accommodate the president or work with the president. And we're going to have to help resolve those tensions that have occurred as a result of that.
Let me ask you about a set of questions that's arisen in the government's response to the pandemic that you might have a particular view on, given your background in public administration as a practitioner of public policy. We've been forced in the last few months to take a critical look at the competence of some of our government's agencies, FDA and CDC and others. Before, as you said, before coming to AI, you spent a lot of time on the inside of public administration. What have you noticed as a result of that about the government response to the pandemic that we should all be noticing too? What kinds of lessons might we learn if we care about having a more effective, competent government after the last few months?
Well, you know, there's a lot has been written about the federal government's response and uncertainty, and sort of taking one position one day and a different position a different day. Scott Gottlieb is an AI scholar, and he's not been afraid to criticize his former colleagues. He worked in the Trump administration. He wants to be helpful, but there have been a lot of sort of missteps, I think, along the way in the federal government as a result during this period. I think they've also been some good things. I'm a little bit loyal to my old friends, the bureaucrats, you know, who are facing very difficult challenges, and I think we tend to exaggerate or stress the failures and then ignore where things have gone well. So I think, you know, one of the tensions Scott Gottlieb constantly says is that I wish there had been a more unified national response. And in some things, we do need a unified national response. But there has also been the benefit of it's a different situation in different states, and different states need some flexibility to rise to the occasion and to find solutions of their own. So I am aware that there is so anyway, that's my point. President Daniels at Purdue, we had him on one of our calls, and I was asking him about this, and he said, you know, with the pandemic, there's been a lot of uncertainty, a lot of things we just didn't understand and didn't know. It's complicated, and he hoped that as we look back on it, that people's you know, arrogance was checked a little bit, because everybody made mistakes, and these are hard. This was a hard challenge. It's continuing to be a hard challenge. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I'm from New York. Governor of New York has gotten a lot of praise for whatever it is he did, but I'm very familiar with the decision he made early on to take patients out of hospitals and put them back into nursing homes, and it caused really great havoc in those nursing homes and death. And, you know, that was a big mistake. And but I guess the last thing I want to say, Yuval, and you talk about this more than anyone else in the country, that these failures and the publication of these failures and the writing about these failures and other failures, all true and legitimate, and our just general cynicism, have led to a loss in confidence in our institutions. And I wrote a piece early on that didn't get a lot of attention, where I said, you know, we make mistakes, but we shouldn't lose confidence entirely in the American ability to respond to a crisis. And one of the things that I think in the current crisis that is not being stressed enough is the thing we all really feared was an overwhelmed hospital system. And with the exception of New York, and maybe only a few hospitals in New York City, mm-hmm. the hospital system has responded we've developed. I said in one interview I did, when the federal government decides to spend money on a tough problem, it spends a lot of money, and it can move. It fought the war, World War II. It can really move resources, and I think there's been a lot of that happening. And so I am hoping that when the full analysis of this is that there'll be lots of examples of mistakes that led to people being discouraged by the ability of our institutions to respond. But I think there'll also be some examples of successes and achievements and heroism that should remind us that we have great capability. We are an innovative people, and our institutions of government, our federalist system, is fundamentally sound. But I know right now that, I said to someone, Yuval, an old colleague from New York who I'd worked with for 12 years, or 15 years in the Pataki administration, and then also with Mayor Bloomberg, about how discouraged I was at one point about the pandemic and about what we were going through. And he just blurted out, "Oh, that's terrible, Robert, because you're always so optimistic." And I am always optimistic. I want to think that we're greater than the problems we face. And I think we are. But right now, it's been a difficult position to take.
Well, this is a good place to turn to some of our student questions. I'm going to call on a few students, and each of them is going to sort of step forward and ask their question themselves. We're going to begin with Michaela Peters of American University. Please go ahead.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, Michaela.
Thank you. Just to start off, many of us are beginning our careers and, of course, considering the various options. So what do you believe are the main benefits to young people in working for a think tank? And what case would you make for this path versus pursuing a career in academia or active politics?
So, first of all, you can do all three. You don't need to, tie yourself to one choice and then not move on to academia and then from there into politics or vice versa. So I would encourage people to know that, as my mother used to say, nothing is irreversible, that you can always change and move in a different direction. And that's been true in my career as well. The benefit of a think tank for a young person is just remarkable. The world of the young people here in AEI, when we're not in pandemic mode, is enormously exciting. Bright, young, committed, patriotic Americans, very intelligent, come here. We give them an opportunity to work with wonderful scholars and work with each other and to be part of a community that just it's enormously exciting. So I do think there's a place for that. I worked at the Washington Monthly, a small public policy magazine, with 5 other 22-year-olds, and I loved it. And so that's a great thing to do when you're young. I think better than going to the Hill and being a congressional staffer, for sure, if you want to get into the world of public policy. Less partisan, less political. So I think it's a great place to go. But I also think that and I say this to interns and RAs who I speak to at AEI, I don't think Washington is necessarily the place for all of you brilliant students. I think that there's tremendous opportunity for smart people interested in public policy all across America, in every town and city and state. And you can rise faster, have more responsibility sooner, and have a bigger impact on the community that you serve and live in much sooner and much more effectively if you go to Des Moines or New York City or LA or wherever, San Antonio. There's a great need for people who are interested in public policy in those places. And then once you've established a record and an expertise and a reputation, then you bring that back to Washington and to make it work on the national level. I think you're in a much stronger position, and I advise young people that all the time. The last thing I would just say about the academy, I find all the time right now that when I talk to young assistant professors or professors in college campuses, I find they feel unable to effectively get their their work and messages into the public policy dialogue unless AEI helps them or another think tank helps them. But being on, the campus of Oberlin or the campus of University of Michigan and doing important work on a really difficult public policy issue, but not having a connection to a platform like ours means that they're really, a tree falling in the forest that no one hears. And of course, if they're conservatives, they may even not even be welcome, in the environment that they are in, because the academy appears to me to be so overwhelmed by the liberal view. So for those of you that have that view, I would be cautioned. I'm concerned about that, and I wouldn't want to lose your brilliance because you got sucked into the intolerance and the restrictions and the bureaucracies and the demands of a university environment. Now that may be too strong, but that's I do hear and see it a lot, and that's why a lot of people want to associate with AEI who are just recently tenured professors or academics, because it gives them a vehicle to get their public policy ideas into the marketplace of ideas.
Thank you.
Was that a little too strong about the academy, or?
I might have thought so a few years ago, but no, I wouldn't say that. Yeah. Thanks, Michaela. We'll take another question from Darcy Boland of St. John's College in Annapolis.
Hello, thank you for coming and speaking with us today.
Hi, Darcy. I've been on the campus of St. John's in Annapolis. I love it.
Excellent, thank you.
Back there soon. I had an old friend who taught one of the Great Books programs there, and David Townsend. He's long retired, but he was a wonderful teacher. Congratulations on going there.
Thank you. I've heard wonderful things about Mr. Townsend. So my question is about poverty and welfare, as has been sort of mentioned before. You've done a lot of work on that problem in cities. So how has this informed how you see the role of AEI going forward? And in particular, do you believe that think tanks have responsibilities to work with local communities?
So the second question is, well, let me start with the first. My work in poverty alleviation confirmed to me, and I wasn't, sure that it was going to be confirmed, that the ideas that had been generated in part through think tank work about work over welfare and two-parent families providing a benefit that single-parent families struggle to overcome, and family matters, and also, by the way, that government assistance properly calibrated and implemented and instituted can be successful in helping people move up. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that what I learned was that you can solve problems with good ideas. You can take good ideas and you can translate them into legislation and into direction for executive branch agencies and government agencies and communities, and you can make progress. And I believe that. I believe that in the fight against poverty. I believe that in our efforts to in the civil rights revolution. And there are others. There are other examples of that. So that's one thing. I've already talked about what I think are the principal ingredients to making those things work, and we don't always do them right or correctly, and we've got a lot of work still to be done. But I guess the principal lesson is that ideas matter, and ideas can be translated into effective public policy, and government can play a role. There are a lot of people on the right and the left that like to say we fought a war on poverty and poverty won. I don't happen to believe that. They're both wrong. So the second question is on local communities. Well, we're a Washington-based think tank, but I often say we're not a Washington-focused think tank. So I want our ideas to get out into communities. I happen to believe communities are one of the sources of our strength as a country, and there's been a lack of interest in localism and local community institutions. So I want us to be better at communicating our ideas beyond, across the Potomac River. And I don't think we are that good at that. So we've made some efforts to make our communication strategy go a little broader. But when you say work with them, I do have to be clear with you that for this think tank at least, there's only so much we can do with the resources we have. And so, I was on the phone this morning with leaders from Grand Rapids, and, they've got a particular problem and a particular issue, and we may, on a special project basis, to send some scholars out there. I'll go out there and we might engage in some partnership with them. I've done that in Cincinnati, and I've done that in other cities during my 6 years as a poverty scholar. But it's not comprehensive. It's not the only activity that we can do, because we have to also be focused on the national picture as well. But going back to the first question, in the world of solving problems for Americans, the real action is at the local level. And so what we do is we want to inform localities, but they're going to have to do it with the ideas that they generate, and hopefully with some ideas that we generate.
Thanks very much, Darcy. We'll take another question now from Kobe Rizek of Yale. Go ahead, Kobe.
There's Kobe.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
My question is, in recent years, there's been a lot of attention on the unique working relationship between AEI and the Brookings Institution, who appear to consider each other more as partners rather than overt competitors. This seems to be in contrast with the manner in which other think tanks view their counterparts, which is often characterized more by disagreement rather than cooperation. What have been the most important outcomes of the AEI Brookings partnership? And do you think that these two organizations can help lead a trend of more friendly cooperation on Think Tank Row?
So that's an interesting question. When I first came to AI, I was responsible for some of the partnership activity between us and Brookings Scholars. I helped convene the working group on poverty and opportunity that was a AI Brookings partnership. And there have been other partnerships like this over the years. And I think we did some good work, and we made an effort to sort of bridge some disagreements and get people to agree on a way forward. And I think that's important. And we took that report all across the country, and people outside of Washington, outside of the partisanship that plagues Washington, really loved it, because they were ideas that were common sense that everyone could agree on and move forward on. So I saw the benefit of that, and I did a separate report on the working class. And there are other things like that have been done. But I'm actually not as focused on that right now as I am on the question Yuval asked, which is what's happening in the world of the conservative world, and how can we partner more with our colleagues who do view themselves as having a particular perspective. And I'm talking about Hoover, the Manhattan Institute, and Heritage. And this past month, I've reached out to the leaders of all three of those institutions and asked if we could do things together to send a message, for instance, about the rising illiberalism on college campuses, and push back a little bit on this sort of radicalism that's emerging on the left in a unified way. I think that's something we need to work on more, if you were going to ask me, in the coming 6 months, year, couple years, than reaching across and with Brookings, who we'll do partnerships. We'll talk to them. They'll be guests in our house. We'll be guests there. But I think the real challenge for the intellectual world in America right now, for people who are sitting in places like where I'm sitting, is with our partners on the right side. We have to get our act together, and then in my opinion, fend off and answer and respond to ideas that are coming that are troubling to me from the other side of the political aisle. And so that may be a little political for a think tank person to say, but that's how I feel about it. And just so you know, you mentioned that Brookings is a partner, not a rival, or I think that's what you said. I view them as a rival. I'm competitive. I want to beat them in the competition for ideas, and I want to. there are some things they say, or CAP says, or the Urban Institute says, that I want to respond to and win in the debate with the American people.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kobe. We'll take another question from Laura Murray from the University of Colorado Boulder. Go ahead, Laura.
My house was just struck by lightning, so I'm sorry that you're
Oh,
seeing
wow.
this from my camera phone. But thank you for being here today. So I grew up in a single parent household under the poverty line, much like the example you raised at the beginning of the conversation. And if my mom pushed past the poverty line in her work via promotions, this meant that we lost benefits greater to the value of her promotions, meaning she would hold back on promotions such that we could receive those benefits. What is your idea of a specific welfare policy which encourages individuals to seek to better their financial positioning while still helping those who need it?
So thank you for the question. And you're absolutely right that benefit programs that provide assistance to low-income working Americans are means tested. And as people's income goes up, they are reduced or ended. And that leads to something that's called a benefit cliff, and can be, in a way, disincentivizing to people to seek the higher job, the better job, the higher salary. And that's something that we have struggled with and we need to continue to work on. One of the ways, just specifically, since you're asking a very specific question related to that, there are actually a lot of ways in which benefit programs can address that. So one is, when we were in New York City, if you were on cash assisted, if you were on food stamp benefits and you were not working, you got a food stamp benefit of a certain amount based on your need. If you went to work, we would not count the effect of those earnings on your benefit calculation for a year. So you got a kind of phase out period. So it wasn't an immediate cut in your benefit package entirely. We would lock them in for a period of time. That's one way you can mitigate the effect of the benefit cliff. You mitigate the effect by, you can also extend benefits further up the income scale so they take a longer to phase out. I actually don't support that as much, frankly, but there is, you could do some of that. And then there are other, and then you can, so those are the ways in which you avoid that. But you got to be careful in saying you're going to always avoid that, or that we never want that to happen, because that contradicts one of the principles of public assistance in my mind in the United States, which is, as your income rises, your need for government assistance diminishes. And so the means test has a role. We want to provide aid to the people that are most in need. And as people's needs become less serious, they are independent and they're on their own. And we want people to aspire to be on their own. I'm not saying that your mother wasn't or that other people aren't. I get the difficulties. But we just, sometimes in these discussions, we get into the language of government needs to respond to all hardships for all people who are below $80,000 a year. And if you start doing that, then we really will be in a situation where the vast majority of American people are in some way receiving a government benefit as part of their their monthly budget. And I don't think that's in the best interest of the United States. And I do want to just say one more thing, because this comes up a lot. I bring up the importance of family structure in the discussion of helping children overcome hardships. And I do that. But I also want to be very clear that there are many ways in which parent households succeed and can overcome the difficulty of not having a parent there, a second parent there all the time. And I've worked most of my career in providing those mitigating assistances to make that happen: child support enforcement, public assistance, and otherwise. But having said that, I also value the role of both parents in a household, and I think we have to talk about that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. We've got another question from Nico Donahue from American University here in DC. Go ahead, Nico.
Hi, sir. It's great to be talking with you. Thank you for allowing us to ask these questions.
Sure.
So I'm curious, looking beyond the coronavirus pandemic, are you more concerned with economic fallout or further civil social breakdown in American society? And what steps might you suggest will most prudently address whichever concern is greater?
So in the middle of the pandemic, we had an awful occurrence in Minneapolis involving George Floyd. And that led to a whole nother series of breakdowns in relationships and in order and in anger and upset, some of it obviously justified. That worries me more, the outcome of that, than our, we're going to get through this pandemic and we're going to get our economy back on its feet. But I'm very concerned about, and I've written a piece about it as well, about this this radicalism that has been motivated by an awful experience in Minneapolis, and the way it has sort of taken over the national dialogue about race and about our country and about the fundamental goodness of our country. And so I'm a little worried about that. I really am. I think, AI has, and Yuval, you need to help me with this a little bit, because AI has had a kind of history, I think, of steering clear of, certain social issues, gay marriage, race, abortion. AI doesn't play a big role in those issues. And maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing, but race is an issue that is being. I'm troubled that it's being. William Julius Wilson, the great Harvard sociologist, wrote a book called "It's Not All About Race," and I'm worried that whatever argument he was making in that book, which was it's not all about race, is being buried, and I don't think that's good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nico. Another question from Max Bodak of Ave Maria. Go ahead, Max.
These are hard questions. I would just like to say these are not easy questions.
No.
Well, in the spirit of hard questions, I'd like to offer some more. And also, it's good to meet both of you, Professor Doar. We actually briefly met in an AEI elevator, and I don't know if you recall that, but it was a very pleasant meeting. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Good. I'm not Professor Doar or Dr. Doar, just Robert Doar.
Yes, sir. Anyways.
No insults, in other words.
Yeah.
Yes, I remember the academia comments. Anyways, so I wanted to, I guess, push back a little bit on your comments that you made about, free markets and the national industrial policy. So I guess I just wanted to ask, do you see any role whatsoever for national industrial policy? Is it preferable that America be mainly a service economy rather than a manufacturing economy? And what about Chris Arnaud's back row workers, those who don't want to go through these credentialing processes and reskilling processes, and those who want to stay in their communities? And then finally, are cheaper consumer goods a primary good, or should we be willing to pay a little more to preserve communities and mediating institutions? So it's a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah.
All of them or none of them.
I'm not. So let's start with the. Look, I'm not a libertarian. So I'm not. I've worked in government, and I've said many times government has a role. But I do worry. I find fascinating the fact some people who I thought of as conservatives and were skeptical of Washington experts' ability to figure it out and solve it for the rest of us. All of a sudden, when it comes to this issue now, they're now in love with the ability of Washington experts to figure out trade and economic activity at the business level. So it's a little bit about while I think we can solve problems, I also am a little skeptical about national solutions with regard to markets. It just makes me nervous that they really won't get it right. On manufacturing, I have two brothers in the manufacturing business. I'm very familiar with the extent to which manufacturing in the United States produces more than ever has in the past. It just does it with fewer workers. So I like manufacturing, and I want there to be more manufacturing in the United States. But I would be careful about what will happen to our country if we get really protective and protectionism really takes off. Because I think, as Senator Hawley said the other day on a conversation, in the aggregate, he said, in the aggregate, yeah, sure, it's better for all of us in the aggregate, but some people get left out. You know, I get that. But let's not forget that for the aggregate, it was better. And so we want to, whatever efforts we make to mitigate the effects on certain populations in certain areas, we need to be very careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I just I'm a little nervous about that. I really am concerned about people thinking they can figure that all out and dictate markets. So I'm skeptical about that. And on the last one, this is also a very popular thing for certain people to say, to disparage, you know, the low cost of all kinds of consumer goods. You know, and I worked in poverty programs, remember, and the low cost of those consumer goods accrued to the benefit of poor Americans. And so I just would be very careful for people to disparage the fact that all kinds of products cost less for people who don't have a lot of money. And I think that's a good thing. And so, you know, if you can call it whatever you want to call it, but higher prices for everyone is not good for poor people. And so I think there's been a little bit of too quick disparagement of, you know, the growth of consumer products. I mean, the availability of consumer products at low prices. You know, lots of economists have looked at the effect of Walmart on people's ability to save and spend, and I believe it's a net benefit to low-income Americans. And you know, that's what I believe. So if that helps, does that address the issue? But having said all that, I do want to say that I do also recognize that some aspects of the trade policies have done damage to certain communities, and we shouldn't ignore them. We should look in to see what we can do. But I want to be careful about undoing the benefits to the aggregate population, which have been real.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Max. We've got time for just one final question, so let's make it a good one. It's going to be another Johnny. We'll hear from Grace Fan Jones of St. John's in Annapolis.
American University and St. John's.
Yeah.
And hi, Grace.
Hi, such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you. So, think tanks are present in countries all across the globe, but I'm wondering if you feel that there is a unique relationship between the think tank and the American system of governance.
I don't know. I don't know whether it's unique or different. In you know, one of the big gaps in my personal development is I am not a very international person, and I regret that. I view my internationalism being related to my love for New York City, and it's an international capital for sure, and a very diverse place. But I have very little honest, really understanding of nation states around the world. I wish I had more. So I don't know whether it's unique or different. I will say, just since we're on the topic of the world, I'm in a coat and tie. You may think I'm in a coat and tie for you, but actually not true. The ambassador, the ambassador to the United States from Taiwan was in our building today, and we had a lovely conversation. And we talked about, you know, the challenges they faced. And next time I see her, I'm going to say, is there a think tank in Taiwan you really rely on to make good decisions, or are you relying on us? Because they look to AI scholars for guidance and influence guidance on ideas and on relations, even with China. So I just don't know whether it's unique or not in other parts of the world. So I want to be careful. Yuval, do you know the answer to that?
No, and I would say I think saying I don't know is probably the hardest thing in our policy.
Yeah, right.
It's one thing we need to learn in the think tank world. I do think, Grace, there's a way that the way we think about government means that oftentimes our public officials just have fewer people around them, fewer staff than you would find in other comparable governments, and that's probably why the think tank began in the United States. But as you say, it's now a feature of a lot of different kinds of systems, and it'd be worth a look at what that looks like.
I think in the UK, I've had some experience. The Manhattan Institute actually took me to the UK early on, and we met with the think tanks there. I think they have a role, and they are also, at least the one that I worked with and talked to, they did have a sort of perspective. There was a very prominent think tank representing sort of the conservative or right of center or market-based view. But I don't know whether that exists in other countries. One of the things I have found in at least in Germany is that they are much more transactional with their research institutions, where business communities will go to them and say, well, we're interested in a study on X, Y, or Z that will say this, and we'll fund that. And we have a lot of that too in the United States. It's just not AEI's way. But this independent, free of influence by people paying for outcomes in your research is true of AEI, and I worry that it's unique. It's too unique. It should not be as unique. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace. And that is really our time. So, Robert, thank you very much for a great conversation and great answers here. And thanks to all of you for joining us.
Yep, thanks very much. I hope I will be invited back. The Hertog Foundation is held in very high regard here at AEI, and I hope all of you will come to AEI when we open up again and bring the benefits of what you've learned in your colleges and in your experiences. So thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.